Hello, my name is Stephanie Reeves, and I'm here with Mr. Stunkel on our second interview regarding Immanuel Lutheran Church history. Good morning, Mr. Stunkel.
Hi.
How are you?
Any day I wake up, it's a good day.
All right, well, that sounds good. It is definitely a good day. So let's get started with the history.
Okay.
Tell us about the history of the bell purchase and the pipe organ.
Okay, the bell purchase and the pipe organ. The pipe organ, when we started the church in 1852, we had no organ. From 1852 to 1883, we had what they called a voiceer. He would be leading the church in song. He had a good voice, or she, whoever it was, and they would lead the church. Then in 1883, they decided to get a organ, paid $800 for it, and they had that till the bad feature there was they had while they wanted to play, they had to have somebody pump the bellows. So that was a problem, but they cured that. And in 1920, the church received electricity, but the whole system wasn't geared for an electric motor, so they still had to keep doing it till they bought the second organ in 1930. That cost them $2,240, and that's the one that we have present to this day yet. And it was moved from the old church into the new church, and it served us well. We've upgraded it a few times. The bell purchase, there's no history about the original bell, but in 1899 it cracked. So they decided to get a new bell. The old bell that cracked weighed 950 pounds. The new one they picked was 1,300 pounds, but when they checked the steeple, they couldn't accommodate it. So they bought one that weighed 1,063 pounds, and they traded in the cracked bell, and they got it for $114. So that's the present bell that's in our belfry today yet. Like I mentioned last time that we had an automatic bell ringer. That thing was purchased in Germany. It couldn't be repaired when I was trustee, so I looked around and I found a ringer, but it was a different type. The old one would rock the bell, whereas this new one, you make the bell stationary and then you just tap it like with a hammer. Well, that works okay, except it's not near as loud as the first one was. And as far as ringing the bell, back in the 1800s, the church bell was rang at 6 or 7 o'clock, depending upon the year, Saturday night, to announce that church is coming tomorrow. It's Sunday. Sunday morning at 7 o'clock, it would ring again, announcing that it was time to get ready for church. Then it would ring again at the church service time. And whenever someone died, they would, the next day at noon, they would ring the bell the amount of times that the person's age was. And being that people were working and the bell was at the church and the school was handy, the teacher would get a 7th or 8th grade boy and bring us over, and we would have to ring the bell. I did it a few times myself.
That was going to be my question, if you had that chance.
It was nice. The only thing you had to watch out, you could tip the bell. If you pulled too hard, you tip it up, and then it wouldn't ring anymore. Yeah. So, you know, it was a little trick to it, but it had a long rope on it. And I've often wondered why during the Lord's Prayer, we always rang the bell 3 times. We not rang it, just tapped it. It was the start, the daily bread, and the ending. And I always thought it was for the triune God. But no, it was for the community, the people that couldn't make it to church or didn't come to church that day. they could say the Lord's Prayer the same time the people in church did. It was a signal to the countryside. So they would know when you started, when you ring it for, they knew when the second one was, that you should be at give us this day our daily bread. And then at the end, they knew when everyone was finished. So that's the real reason behind the 3 taps. So I think that just about covers the bell. The one we have now was cast in 1898 in Philadelphia. But it's still up there today.
Very interesting. Now, speaking of the bell ringing 3 times during the Lord's Prayer, let's go into some of the customs. What were some of the customs during the time?
Well, I went over the seating arrangement last time. One custom we had was we had no Sunday school. So, but what we did have was church service. When school was in session, all the children, instead of sitting upstairs in the front row, they'd sit in the front 2 pews of both sides of the church. When church service was over, ready for the benediction, then the pastor would just come down from the altar and come in front of the children, and we'd had what they called Christenlehre. That is children learning in English. And we would have a 10 or 15 minute just a discussion, and he would explain and ask questions. That was our Sunday school. So that was a custom, and like I said, that's about the only thing I think I missed. One other thing. In front, the front church, the center was the altar. One side was the pastor's office. The other side had 3 short rows of pews. You could call it a choir wing, but it wasn't big enough. So, but that was custom that the elders would come and sit in those 3 pews at the beginning of the service, and then they had the collection plate, them long wicker baskets with the poles hanging there. They'd come when the collection was and collect and bring them to that area, and then they'd sit down and wait for church service to be over.
All right.
That was another custom.
Okay. What were some of the events in 1852 that the church had?
Okay, 1852, I think I can start with, I guess maybe God had something in mind when they picked this 15 acres. It's Cicero's on the one side, and that was a road, because I know my ancestors used it to haul grain to Chicago. But Sauk Trail turned out, from what I see in history and what's been recorded, it was the superhighway. Most of us think of Sauk Trail as you look east, you end in Dyer. You go west, it ends in Frankfort. Well, that's not so. It starts in Detroit and ends in Moline, Illinois. And the reason was the Indians used the trail for purposes of, they would, in the central, in anything west of us here towards the Mississippi, they would trap and have all their wares. And once a year, they would make a trek to Detroit to barter. And from what was recorded in local history, that they would walk single file, and they would walk with men, women, children, and horses, but they had no wagons. They would put a pole on each side of the horse, and then hitch it to the horse, and then they would drag on the ground, and they would strap all their belongings that they wanted to barter onto that between the poles. It was like a makeshift drag. And those treks would last for 2.5 days. I'm sure they bedded down for the evening, but it took 2.5 days to make the trip to Detroit. And one other thing that sticks in my mind with Sauk Trail is this church was started in June of 1852. Our first burial on the cemetery right east of us here was in August of 52. And that's the first recorded one. But my ancestors did a family tree, and they mentioned that they were there at the time. What happened was it was also used as a road for white immigrants moving back and forth. Sauk Trail was, and history has it that two men, they had oxen on wagons, covered wagons, and they got into a argument, and they wagered who had the best team or who was going to drag race. I don't know what, but they made a wager. So during the test, one of the covered wagons upset, and there was a 6-year-old child in the one, and it got killed. So that is the first burial on this cemetery, but it's not recorded because it was not a church member. See, the first cemetery that here on the west side of the road was only recorded members' burials. As far as burials go, there's 439 buried on this burial site. Across the road, the newer part, we have 360 some. So it's now it's been the newer one has a record because it was separated from the church. So we had a separate treasurer and everything, and the new one, we paid $600 for 2 acres on the new cemetery. So that's about what I can come up with on customs.
All right. And I did want to talk with you more about the cemetery, the old and new cemetery.
Okay.
So can you expound more?
The old cemetery was laid out. They started at Cicero Avenue and worked their way west. And they went in rows, adults in a row, then children, then adult, children, all the way across. There's 10 rows on there, 5 children and 5 adults. And families did not get buried together. They buried them. If you died, you were next to the last one that died. So, I mean, they're scattered all over the cemetery. On the new cemetery, we have lots. You purchase it, and husband, wife, and children, up to 6 or 7 families members can be in one plot. So that's about how they work that. The new cemetery, the old cemetery was supported by the church. The new one has been self-supporting through donations and sales of lots. And I guess that about covers the cemetery part. We have certain rules. We have first option to repurchase any lot that there is. So we don't want to, it's not a public cemetery. I mean, we will accept Christians in that, but it's not considered a public cemetery.
Okay. Tell us about the old church furnace. I know you mentioned the basement.
The old church was built in 1861 and cost $163. And
times have
they
changed.
put it up, and there's no record that I know of how they heated it. I would imagine it was like the school, that it had a stove in someplace in the sanctuary, but it was decided that that wasn't good enough anymore, so there was no basement. So evidently, I never heard that they moved the church, so I think they dug it by hand. I never was down there, but there was nothing really to see because there was a door at the southeast corner of the church with steps going down, and all they had down there was a 25 by 20 basement. And what they did was they made it small, then they installed a furnace, and they had the heat coming up through the floor in the church right in the center aisle. It was about a 4-foot by 4-foot opening, and when you walked across, it was a vent, and somebody had to come on Saturday night and start the furnace and get so the church was warm Sunday morning. And they used the extra space in the basement was to house the coal and wood or whatever they were using for firewood or whatever. But I'm almost positive they dug it by hand. So, but it never had any use as to, there were no parties or anything down there. 25 by 20 is, the furnace took up
Right,
most of it.
absolutely.
And it was hot air.
Okay. All right. Let's go ahead. You mentioned the school. Tell us about the school size, its usage, and the sale of the school at the time.
Okay, the school in 1948, they decided the old two-room school wasn't sufficient, so they built a new brick school I think it was west of the old school. And it had a basement and it had the first floor. The first floor was up off, there was about 5-6 steps going up to the first floor. The 4 lower grades were at upstairs and the 5th to 8th was downstairs. And we sold the old school to, there was an airport south of here between Governor's Highway and Route 50 at the Y, and he bought it for an office. He bought it for $1,500 and he moved it, and eventually it did burn down there. But in 1965, the brick school burned. So there was a debate was should we rebuild or should we add to the church, and it was decided to add to the church, and what we have today on the west side of the church is in 1966. That's what transpired, and that's what we have today. That's how we got this new school.
All right. Okay. And you did mention how the unfortunate event of the brick school burning.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay, that was something else. How about the original teacher house in Sale?
The original teacher house had to be moved when we built this church because Cicero Avenue was getting wider, and we had to move away from the highway. So the church was moved and to where I stated last time, to Old Money Road. The school, or the old teacherage, and it was pastorage, church and school, I think we gave it away for nothing to a farmer in Green Garden, and he moved it, and I'm not sure if it's still standing today or not, but that we gave that away, and that was also made use of at the time. And while I'm talking about school, I might add that the school and the teacher and pastor, when I went to school, they had animals. The pastor had a cow, and I don't know what else he had, I don't remember, but the teacher had some goats, chickens, and the older boys, we spent our time learning out there, helping him with the chores, and they had a big and they had a big garden right next to the cemetery, and that's so it was very interesting, and those days, if you made the kids do that nowadays, you would have trouble.
Right.
But the oddity was in 1948, our school had indoor plumbing, but the church didn't.
Wow.
The church
Okay.
never had it in the old church. Church was in 1961. It still had outdoor plumbing.
Okay.
So,
Now, I'm sure with all of the animals and the garden at the school, that made learning authentic for you. Tell me a little more about that.
well, it was routine for us because we all came from a farm setting, and it was natural for us. In fact, sometimes we enjoyed it because you got out of class.
Okay.
But that wasn't always the case. But it was a learning experience, and for the most part, we enjoyed it.
Yeah, like a hands-on science lesson.
Well, I guess
that
you
you
could
have
call
there,
it that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Now, were those animals, did the teacher and the pastor eventually eat them, or
Well,
if they were more
the
so
pastor
pets?
used his for milk, and the farmers would bring him hay and that, so he had feed. The teacher used his goats for milk and chickens for eggs and that. And
Okay.
and I mean, I was you know, 7th, 8th grade. I'm sure they you know, got rid of them, but I just don't know how they
Right.
got rid of them. But
Okay.
I'm sure the farmers helped them. You know, maybe a farmer took them or something, or
Okay.
you know, it was the pastor had a barn, and the teacher had a chicken house, and he made another building next to the garage for his goats.
Okay.
So
I wonder how that would go over now, if the pastor
Well,
had to have.
I'd like to see it tried.
Right. I would too. Oh. Tell us about the Walther League, youth group choir.
The Walther League was a league like a youth group back in, I can only relate to the 20s and 30s, that some churches, the youth joined them and some didn't. It was like a youth group, but it was more of a, not a national, but it was a lot of churches banded together, and they would do things together. It was just an organized youth group, but on a bigger scale.
Okay.
And some of our church members did belong to the Walther League, but it disbanded before I was of the age that I would join.
Okay. Now, what age range?
It would have been around 17, 18. You would have, at that time, that was the time when you had to go to work and that. So, I mean, you were even working before that. But yeah, it was a nice time, and like I say, it wouldn't go anyplace today.
Okay. And this was a male and female choir?
Yeah, it was.
Okay.
Yeah, it was male and female. They were youth group, mixed group.
Okay.
And one thing I might add before I forget and before we close, it's in my family tree book, but it was the common thing at that time. In the late 1800s, whenever there was a wedding, they wouldn't send out invitations. They would take a horse, decorate him with ribbons and stuff, and somebody would ride around and verbally invite the people to the wedding.
Okay. That's
And-
personable.
And he would have bells on, and you know, he would maybe he shot the shotgun or something, and you know, he made noise, and it was custom in that time. I mean, I don't even know when mail started, but I mean, there had to be some kind of a communication, and that's what they did. And being that churches were so close together, nobody lived further than 3 miles from the church.
Okay.
So that was one thing that I'm sure that was happening in other families too, but that did happen.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you again, Mr. Stunkel. And before we close, would you please close us out with the Lord's Prayer in German?
Okay, I hope you can understand it.
Okay.
Vater unser, der du bist im Himmel, geheiligt werde dein Name, dein Reich komme, dein Wille geschehe, wie im Himmel, als auch auf Erden. Unser täglich Brot gib uns heute, und vergib uns unsere Schuld, als wir vergeben unser Schuldigern. Und führe uns nicht in Versuchung, sondern erlöse uns von dem Evil. Denn das ist die Reich und die Kraft und die Heiligkeit in Ewigkeit. Amen.
Amen. Thank you.